Much of what you'll do in terms of interface design and navigation design involve convention and metaphor, and we use both in order to set and keep standards. And I'll explain what I mean by that. The appearance and location of common navigation systems have evolved, and over time they've become conventions. For example, when tabbed navigation was first introduced somewhere back in the early 2000s, the rest of the world went, "Oh my God, that makes so much sense. Now we have to have tabs for navigation." And that's a convention that continues to this day. So it sort of became a standard. It's not the only way to navigate, mind you, but it's a convention. When we look at it, we know exactly what it is. Conventions tell us what to look for and where to look when we need them. So putting them in a standard place lets us locate them quickly. If you've been around for a while, you'll notice that at one point on the web, left-hand navigation was very common. Main navigation, left-handed navigation was almost always sort of the way to go. Well, then at some point we started moving towards this idea that horizontal navigation across the top was much more efficient because it took up less screen real estate, and as monitor screens became wider as opposed to taller, it made more sense. So when that nav is up there, front and center, we can locate it quickly because we're used to seeing it there. When we standardize the appearance of things, that makes it easy to pick them out among everything else. When there's a tab at the top, we know that that's a navigation menu. When it's just some text that happens to appear up there next to the logo, it's not quite as easy to tell that, okay, well, that's my wayfinding mechanism. That's the nav. That's how I get around. So the way that you treat it determines how easy it is to sort of segregate it in your mind and go, okay, I get it. That's what that is, and that's how it works. It's extremely frustrating to us when one of those conventions is broken. For instance, if somebody tomorrow decided we're going to put main navigation on the bottom of the screen from now on, that would frustrate us because we would be looking at the top of the screen wondering where the hell the navigation is because we're not used to looking down at the bottom for that core component. It's not where we expect it to be. It's not the position we expect it to take, and it doesn't match our model of how things work. So setting those standards and then being consistent in how you apply them is extremely important. So let's take a look at some standard web-based conventions. The first core component of just about any website is the header. And in the header, we expect to see certain things. Number one, a site identifier, which is typically a logo located in the left-hand corner. And we also typically know that by clicking on that logo, we can get back to the home screen at any point. Again, that's something that's been built in over time, and we're used to it and we recognize it. We also almost always have a search function, especially on some sort of site or application that has a large volume of information. We know that we can use search as a faster method of finding exactly what we want. Next, we have a main navigation menu. This is our core tool for getting around the site. We know that it represents all the core areas of information. It represents all the main categories that are contained within, and it gives us an immediate sense of where we can go. There's also usually a set of utilities that are relegated to a higher position, almost always in the top right corner. Those are things like sign into your account, your order status on an e-commerce site, any personalized information like your profile or things like that. And any help is usually located in that area as well. Finally, in the case of an e-commerce site, we have an area that shows us our shopping cart. Here's what we've bought so far. Here's what we've put in our cart. The point is that if we're browsing the web, these are conventions that we absolutely expect to come across. We expect to see them up there, and we typically expect them to be in these positions. Next, especially in the case of e-commerce sites, we almost always see some sort of left-hand local navigation. These are things at the current level. These are things within the current category that I am browsing. These are choices I can make based on the category of information that I've selected. They're things I can do right now. Next, there's a page name which reiterates where I am in the current scheme of things. It confirms that what I clicked on is indeed where I landed. The next thing I see is a current or a new feature. This is either something that the site's creator wants me to see up front, or it's something that I am most likely to need or be interested in. It's almost always a link to more detailed content, more expansive content, but it's giving me a taste of it up front. At that point, I'm usually given some level of social proof. The rise of social media and social networking has given way to the idea that whenever possible, we want to show people what other people are doing. Okay, in this case, we see customer favorites, and we have categories for that. Essential reading. This is what people deem to be, noteworthy. We have the under $2.99 section, which I'm sure is very popular with people. We have new releases, spotlight releases, and then we have what's trending. What are people into now? What's becoming popular? These are all conventions. These are all things that we expect to see. These are all things that we instantly recognize without having to think very hard, if at all, about. And there are things that we can instantly act upon. That's the importance and the power of convention. You're leveraging what I already know. You're leveraging what I expect to see. And you're matching my expectations about what these things are, how they're organized, where they are on the screen, and how they work. Conventions are valuable largely because they speak directly to habit and reflex. Convention allows us to apply those same reflexes in different circumstances. For example, conventions often become standards for devices that have nothing to do with the one that started the idea. And perhaps most importantly, an interface design should be consistent with other interfaces that people are already familiar with. They're not using what you've built and designed in a vacuum, okay? They're using it in conjunction with lots of other things. So while your product may be a mobile app, they're also using stuff on a laptop. They're also using stuff on a desktop. They're also interacting with screen controls on their TV. They're having all these different experiences which affect how they expect things to work. So a certain degree of consistency goes a long way. And your interface should also be consistent with itself. As we said a short while ago, once you introduce a behavior, once you introduce where something is located, what it looks like, what it does, how it behaves, that should carry through every subsequent experience. Windows 8 at the moment has taken a very bold step forward in introducing sort of a new interaction paradigm, all right, specifically in the way that it looks, the way it sits on the screen, and the way that you move through the information. However, some of this stuff is still very familiar. We're still dealing with tiled icons on a screen, which is essentially a metaphor that's been around for a while, from the first mobile phones to having icons on a Windows desktop. It's the same thing. It's done in a very different way, and it navigates in a somewhat different fashion, right? There's sort of a scrolling motion that happens from left to right. But again, it's still rooted in things that we already know and understand. It's still rooted in the same conventions that we're familiar with. So even though it breaks some of those, it probably still has a very good chance of high adoption rate. People will become familiar with its ins and outs and its little idiosyncrasies. What the key is going to be for Microsoft is that they apply these behaviors and these interactions and all these things that they're introducing in this new system consistently throughout the operating system, throughout any related applications, throughout every device that it lives on, right? From laptops to tablets to mobile phones. It's got to be consistent, and it's got to reinforce those lessons of how this works over and over and over and over again, because that's how people will become familiar enough with it that the ways in which they use it will become habits and reflexes. Metaphors are also often used in interface design, and in order for them to be effective, they have to be intuitive and they have to be obvious. Just like a spoken metaphor can provide a shortcut in terms of language, a visual metaphor provides the same kind of shortcut for how to use something. An intuitive interface often leans on a metaphor that we instantly recognize from day-to-day life. These are called affordances. They're visual cues for what you can do and how you can do it. Gaming and entertainment apps in particular benefit greatly from metaphor. Okay, here are some examples. Here's a virtual DJ app that you use on your phone to do some mixing and scratching, right? But the metaphor is the same as the real world object. It's a turntable with a slab of vinyl on it, and you can manipulate it with your hand just like you can a regular turntable. Here's an interface that simulates a guitar amp and an effects pedal. Common metaphors to guitarists. These look exactly like the real world objects. The knobs are in the same place. They visually look exactly the same. So when somebody uses this, they automatically know what to do with all these things. That's an affordance. That's a visual cue based on a metaphor. Here's Apple's Bookshelf app that shows you all the books and or PDFs that you've downloaded. The metaphor is it's just like a shelf at home that has all your books on it, except for the fact that you're looking at the covers instead of the spines, okay? A truer metaphor would be this, to show the spines, but at the same time, it doesn't matter. We get it anyway. We still know what it is. We still know what it means. We still know what to do with it. Finally, here's a virtual wallet, which shows our credit cards stacked up in much the same way we would find them in an actual wallet. Again, the metaphor holds true, makes perfect sense. We automatically know what these things are, and we know what we can do with them. So those are just some ways in which metaphors can be used to enable use. While metaphors are valuable, it's also very easy to abuse them. You need to use metaphors with caution. Whenever you're considering the use of a metaphor in an interface design, remember that metaphors are culturally subjective. If what you're creating potentially has global use, you have to realize that some of the things that you take for granted in terms of people recognizing them may not be equally relevant to people from different cultures. The other thing about metaphors is that they require mental effort. So in situations where actions or activity has to be absolutely, sort of lightning quick, metaphors may not be the best way to go about representing things. Metaphors can also obscure the nature of a feature instead of revealing it. That's especially true if the range of content, features, and functionality is very diverse. The guess that happens when we try to figure out what the metaphor means becomes less reliable the more options that there are behind it. In most cases, it would be better and simpler just to eliminate guesswork altogether. Last but not least, metaphors that have universal understanding are pretty hard to come by, to be honest. Even though an association between a metaphor and a feature or a function might be very clear to you, it's probably one of any number of associations that someone else might make, okay, your users, especially if they come, as we said, from a different cultural background than you do. For instance, the page curl feature that exists on the iPhone is something at this point that we know how to use. But the reason we know how to use it is because the very first time we inadvertently touched the map, we saw what happened. In that scenario where there's no real consequence for not figuring that out right away, that's okay because we have time to learn how it works and it's kind of fun figuring it out. But in the situation of a work-related application, where let's say you use the same metaphor and you hide features underneath the page curl in something completely different, there's a little more stress associated with a work-related task. So it may not be the appropriate place to invite people to have fun and figure out, how your interface works. They're just trying to get their job done, right? And they really don't want to play games. They just want to get done and get out. So metaphors are certainly helpful, but you have to be very, very conscious of the context in which you use them, and you have to be sure that they're going to be well understood by the majority of your users.